Hello, everyone. I'm Victor Glass, your host for today's webinar. The title of the webinar is Resilience, New Threats and Opportunities for the Electric Grid of the Future. For those who are not familiar with the Rutgers Center for Research and Regulated Industries, um, its mission is to promote research, scholarship, and education in regulatory economics that's aimed at improving public policy. Okay. Okay, we're up to 79. So the mission of CRI is to promote research, scholarship, and education in regulatory economics aimed at public policy. Please visit our website to see what we're about. The center has been in existence for more than 40 years. It was founded by Dr. Michael Crew. I'm the current host and director. He retired about 5 years ago. The main focus of CRI is utility regulation. So we cover electric utilities, water, gas, postal, and telecom. The theme of today's webinar is resilience, and it's motivated by the idea that hurricanes, wildfires, intermittent renewable energy sources, distributed energy sources are all testing the resilience of the grid to withstand sudden power interruptions and recover quickly from power outages. What we'd like to do is, in this webinar, is focus on defining resilience, developing metrics, estimating costs and benefits, and implementing policies to achieve a basic standard of resilience are key features of regulatory policy. I don't mean to imply that this one webinar is going to solve that problem. It's just going to present a whole, a kind of a landscape of what the issues are. And to do that, the webinar brings together key industry leaders to discuss the challenges ahead. And when you see the bios of our participants, you'll realize that we really have a wonderful group of presenters and moderator. So this webinar is going to start with 4 basic questions that may lead to future webinars. And the first one is, what is the meaning of resilience? That's hotly debated and it hasn't been nailed down. How is resilience different from reliability? Why is resilience hard to assess and measure? And what does the changing topology of the grid mean to the regulatory community? That's an extremely important, that's the key issue as the topology has been changing rapidly, it requires updates, not only from a technical standpoint, an economic, different types of ways of thinking about it economically, and certainly policy. Our experts today, and I'll go into their backgrounds in a minute. I'll just mention their names. The moderator is going to be Jeanne Fox, and I'll talk about her background in a little bit. But before I get into the backgrounds of the presenters and the moderator, I want to acknowledge that Jeanne and Bob Entricken of EPRI were critical for defining and organizing this webinar. And that's one thing that CRI likes to do, is to facilitate organizing based on people who have great ideas and insights into the industry. The presenters are Granger Morgan, John MOURA, Susan Tierney, and David Victor. And let me just give you a little bit, I don't want to spend too much time, but these people have such amazing backgrounds. And I don't know how they had all the time to do what they've done, but it's thoroughly impressive. Jeanne is an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and at Rutgers University School of Arts and Sciences. She served as a commissioner of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities from January 2002 to September 2014. She was a board president and a member of the governor's cabinet from January 2002 to January 2010. She was a member of the National Petroleum Council and the Emergency Preparedness Committee, Carnegie Mellon University's advisory board for its Center for Climate Energy Decision Making, Rutgers University Energy Institute Advisory Board, Grid Alternatives Tri-State Board of Directors, and an active member of NARUC. Perhaps what sums up her background and her achievements is she is also a member of Rutgers Hall of Distinguished Alumni. That's a pretty impressive achievement. Next is Granger Morgan. And again, the backgrounds are so illustrious. He's a Hamerschlag University Professor of Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. He holds 3 appointments: Department of Engineering and Public Policy, where he served for 38 years as the founding department head, also to the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and in the H.J. Heinz III College of Public Policy and Management. He's a fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE, the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and the Society of Risk Analysis. Morgan is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, where he chaired 3 consensus studies on electric power, including, and here's the important one, for our purposes today, the 2017 study enhancing the resiliency of the nation's electricity system. So he's been at it for quite some time. John MOURA is the Director of Reliability Assessment and Systems Analysis for North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. At NERC, he leads the Electric Reliability Organization's effort to independently assess and report on the overall reliability, adequacy, and associated risks of the interconnected North American bulk power system. John leads the development of NERC's annual long-term and seasonal reliability assessments, as well as NERC's efforts in evaluating reliability impacts of potential environmental regulations, high levels of variable generation, and an increasing dependence on natural gas. And also important is John earned his bachelor's degree from Rutgers University. Susan TIERNEY. Susan is a senior advisor for the analysis group and is an expert on energy economics, regulation, and policy, particularly in electric and gas industries. Previously, she served as the Assistant Secretary of Policy at Department of Energy. She was the Secretary for Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts, Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, Chairman of the Board of the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, and Executive Director of Massachusetts Energy Facility Siting Council. She chaired DOE's Electricity Advisory Committee, as well as the External Advisory Board of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and she previously served on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board. She was a director of the World Resources Institute, Resources for the Future, and other boards. Susan received her PhD and MA in regional planning from Cornell University. David Victor, going alphabetically, our last presenter is Director of the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation and Professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. He is a former director of Stanford's program on energy and sustainable development and professor at Stanford University Law School. He was also a member of the NAS Grid Resiliency Study Panel. He is a former member of the board of directors of EPRI, and was on the advisory council of the Institute for Nuclear Power Plant Operators. The format today is that Jeanne Fox will be our moderator, and the presenters will present. There may be one or two short questions between presentations, followed by open discussion. Please turn off your microphone and video camera, and please direct your comments to Jeanne and to me through the chat window.
I want to thank Victor for this at the Rutgers Center for Research and Regulated Industries is at the Business School for having this, putting this together. It's pretty exciting, and I'm going to be working with him a little bit in the future. So this is a broad overview of resiliency on the grid, impacting all of it, the electric system, the grid, transmission, distribution, communications within that system. We all know climate change is happening. It's a catastrophe. The world's weather will continue to become more extreme, more damaging, likely leading to a lot more outages. And at least our current electric system has been functioning for over 100 years, and it's got a problem now with the extreme weather events. The fossil fuels must be significantly reduced to save the planet and to save our ecosystems and to save humans and other life forms. So what has been done and what can or should be done to mitigate climate change impacts. This theory panel of experts are very well known in their field. Will give a basic for you on the phone, on this video, a 101 for reliability and resiliency of our total electric system, generation, transmission, and distribution. As Victor mentioned, I was privileged to serve on the National Academy panel on enhancing the resilience of the nation's electric system, which was released in 2017. And Granger Morgan, as was said, chaired that panel. And also, I note that both David and Sue were on that panel. I also note Granger is chairing another panel that hopefully, and David and Sue are on that, will be coming out sometime later this coming spring. The fourth panelist is the younger among us. He's NERC's top reliability director, and he happens to be another Rutgers alum like I am. So as Victor mentioned, I encourage you to put any questions in the chat box, and Victor will be looking through them. Kick it off with an overview, and I'll just let him jump right into it.
All right, Victor, could you put, yeah, good, thank you. So, of course, most disruptions are brief and local. There are things like lightning strikes, falling trees, squirrels that get into the wrong place, vehicles crashing into poles, causing little prolonged disruption of daily life. And these events result in short-term power outages, as evidenced by the average duration of routine power outages in the U.S. in the latest years for which there are data, 2016 and 17, of roughly an hour or a little less. However, such outages aren't the subject of our discussion today. Our concern is with large outages of long duration, or LLD outages. Next. And so here's a plot of that, of large outages. This is actually a curve that JEANNE originally produced, and then we updated it at the National Academy and several others. You can see that it has a fat tail. No, hit another button. So I didn't realize, I thought I was going to get to run myself. So anyway, as I said, the distribution of large outages of long duration has a fat tail. That is, though they are somewhat more common than one might otherwise have thought. The plot in the lower right shows you that nevertheless, on the continental U.S., even for large hurricanes like Wilma and Irma, we get recovery fairly quickly in a matter of some weeks or days. The obvious exception being Puerto Rico, which I've plotted here, which took the better half of half a year or so. Next slide, please. And so there can be many causes of such outages. Some may be, most of them, of course, are natural events, and I've listed a whole bunch of them here. Hurricanes are perhaps the ones we're most familiar with, but earthquakes could do a job on the West Coast power system, as could volcanoes in the Northwest. space weather could have a major impact on the power system. We've been very fortunate that we've not had a major event of that sort. But then we also need to be concerned about human-induced events, physical attacks, cyber attacks, and either operational mistakes or errors. Next, please. And you can plot these things in terms of the amount of warning time and the time to restore. That gets kind of messy. And rather than going through that, I'm going to simply show you a collage on the next slide that we can sort of get some sense of what a lot of these things might look like. Next, please. So starting on the right are a couple of reports on the potential that large solar storms could have on the North American power system. In the left, the upper left red, and an Academy report, the notion that terrorism could do a big job on the power system. The picture in the middle, of course, is ice to remind us of ice storms, and then below that, flooding and other extreme storms. That line of tornadoes in the lower right is to remind us that while a single tornado can do a job on a chunk of power system, a series of tornadoes of the sort that's shown there could really take out quite a lot of the system. And the lower left is a picture to remind us that earthquakes could be highly destructive to the infrastructure of the system. Next slide, please. So we have pretty good metrics of reliability. And I've shown a couple of pictures here, as I said at the outset, with the exception of larger outages, the lighter pink here caused by major events. We've been having, on average, about a couple of hours or less of disruption, the average customer across the U.S. But because large outages of long duration are rare, it's much more difficult to develop metrics for reliability, for resiliency. In the reliability metrics are based on going back and looking at long time series where we can say how many outages were there. Resiliency, though, involves fairly rare events, and so we don't have long time series. And the best way probably to develop metrics, although it hasn't really been done very adequately yet, is to do simulation studies. Now, there are technologies, of course, that I can use to harden the system. I can harden generators and substations. I can move facilities that were vulnerable to flooding, like, for example, many of the generator plants in Hawaii were at one stage right down on almost at sea level, and they've been moved to higher ground. I can move wires underground, although, of course, I got to worry about flooding manholes. I can replace wooden poles with steel or reinforced concrete poles. But if I do all of those things, how do I know how much more resilience I've instituted? And so what I basically need to do is build simulation models to assess damages in the event of a variety of disruptions. Folks like Argonne National Labs have been building models of this. They still have quite a long way to go. Next slide. So here's the report that Victor and Jean mentioned. If you'd hit one more forward, you'll see that 4 of us are co-authors of this report. And last slide, please. This is how we chose to design or to define resilience. As a life cycle process, you really want to do stuff ahead of time of the sort that I just talked about prior to an event to make sure that you can absorb shocks, that they don't have as dire effect as they might otherwise. Then during an event, you want to be able to manage the disruption. And I have a second, even smaller set of slides that we can look at in a minute about strategies to do that. It turns out that even a little bit of power can be really valuable during such an event. After an event, of course, I want to have been ready to put things back together very quickly. And then it's very important that I observe and learn so that the next time I get hit with one of these things, I will be in a better position to make a speedy recovery or to invest in other kinds of activities to mitigate effects when an event is occurring. And that's all I have on that first slide deck. So maybe you'd take the slides down and we go back to Jeanne. Jeanne, are you
Okay.
there?
Granger, what I'm going to do is for everybody, I'm going to give you one question after you talk. If the other three panelists want to say something about it, feel free, but we want to make sure we get to Susan, who's at the end. So Granger, please explain what is meant by the concept of resilience. How is resilience different from reliability? And why is it hard to assess and measure resilience?
Okay, well, I think that next to last slide that that one of those slides that I just showed gets to that point. I mean, reliability, as I said, is relatively easy to describe in terms of time series analysis of outages. And every power company in the country keeps track of this. And so there are these various standard metrics to measure reliability. Resilience, on the other hand, if we're talking about relatively low frequency events, that is, events that only occur occasionally, you can't assess on the basis of time series because you haven't had very many. I mean, how resilient are we, for example, to a major earthquake in Southern California? Well, we haven't had earthquakes in
Super, thanks. All good, thank you.
This technology has a way to go, I would say.
Yeah, everybody has to remember to mute yourself. I think everybody almost is.
It only takes one.
Yes.
So I'll just wrap up quickly. I mean, because we don't have time, we haven't had lots of events, and we can't say before and after, if I implement a variety of things, how more resilient something gets. We have the problem that we basically got to rely on something like simulation studies.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. I could listen to Granger for days on this, but we won't do that right now. The next speaker will be John MOURA, who's Mr. Reliability Assessment at NERC. He's their director, and he's going to speak, and I have a question or two for him. John, take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm still wondering what I'm doing here with all these distinguished panelists. But pleasure to be here, and pleasure to be at an event with my alma mater. I hope you remember me in the future. It's very difficult to get a good bagel around here. I'd love to come up there and see everybody in person at some point. But anyway, thank you for the invitation. I should have known Bob Entrikin had something to do with me being here. Appreciate him bringing me to the table and being part of the discussion. As we talk about resilience and kind of reliability, and it's kind of been topic of conversation for probably the past 2 years at least, it's really understanding what the difference is between them, and kind of understanding the differences really to understand, well, who are the decision makers that decide where should we spend in order to get reliability and resilience improvements, and who do we turn to talk about certain risks that are emerging and improvements that are needed, and kind of direction in order to make sure our resource mix is changed in a reliable manner, doesn't degrade reliability. We want to bring on new resources. We want to retire resources that we don't want online anymore, that are uneconomic. And so how do we build that bridge to where we have a reliable and resilient system in the face of some of the challenges associated with them? And I think it's important, as we go to the next slide, to talk a little bit about what NERC does, what I do in particular. And not everyone knows about NERC and kind of this, they know about the state regulatory groups and, of course, FERC, the federal. We know about DOE and their sponsorship with the research. But, this international organization, the ERO or NERC, where, we've got regulatory authorities and responsibilities in both Canada and the U.S., as well as just a little bit of Mexico. And we basically do two different things. We set and enforce reliability standards. And when we talk about reliability, I'll talk about it just in a bit, it's It's really about the uncontrolled cascading instability of the system. And what we're not talking about is the order and construction of generation or transmission. Per the Section 215 of the Federal Power Act, we are explicitly prohibited from ordering that. And so kind of resource adequacy is mostly out of our jurisdiction from a regulatory perspective, but we do assess it. And that's really kind of my role, is to assess reliability, look backwards at how the trends of reliability have been. Speaking to that, I hope the next 10 years are as reliable as the last 10 years. We have continuous improvements that we've seen, but also looking forward and what are the challenges. And resilience seems to kind of pop at the top of the heap here, because the resource mix changes we're seeing really call into question some of these resilience attributes that we've really had embedded within our existing resource mix. We'll go to the next slide. And just to kind of separate it a bit, because it is really important from a jurisdictional perspective, and what does NERC, what does NERC cover, and maybe what are in the jurisdiction of either FERC or states. When we look at reliability, it's really those kind of two different components. One is the adequacy, so how much generation, how much resources do we have to serve load, and can we do that even with transmission constraints that are built within the system? And then the other piece, and a lot of, and for adequacy, that authority really lies with the states, and of course, and the provinces for Canada. But then operating reliability is really where our standards are, and that's really the idea that load and resources or your generation are constantly in balance. And when there is a disturbance on the system, we need to recover from that disturbance quickly. And so does the system have, go to the next slide, the system have an adequate level of reliability? And that's kind of what FERC has asked us. Within the scope of NERC reliability standards, what are your performance objectives? And that's kind of what our reliability standards are all about. They're the instruction manuals for operating one of the largest, most powerful machines in the world. And what you see here is that reliability and resilience are both kind of part of that. Now, they are different. As Granger mentioned, reliability is really a specific system performance measure. You can easily measure it. You either did have instability, you either did have frequency within defined parameters, you either did have voltage within the defined parameters, or you didn't, and which led to a load shed. The resilience components are a little bit different. It's after you've gone beyond design criteria, can I still manage the system so that I can recover quickly, I can serve the next day? That's a really important piece of reliability. It's not just about maintaining load and serving load, but serving it the next day, right? Will I still have transformers the next day? Because if they're damaged, I got to get in line for 9 months or 10 months to these pieces of equipment aren't manufactured here in the U.S. So having management plans, having a way to manage things that are beyond design criteria and be able to restore when there's major system disturbances. And remember, you can't have infinite or perfect reliability because it would cost infinite amount of dollars. And so restoration, being able to recover from things that may be prohibitively expensive are, a perfectly good way to manage extreme events. Next slide. This is a classic curve you'll see when we talk about resilience framework and kind of the V-shaped recovery, being able to pre-posture your system if you can, having a slow degradation and being able to recover. Now, the red triangle there is, places from a regulatory perspective, policy, market, there's a lot of different tools we can use here to avoid that and control that in a way that it doesn't go beyond some design criteria that we want, right? So it's okay to recover in, 2 to 3 days, might not be able to, it might not be good or sufficient to recover in 7 days. all right, or 2 weeks. Those would be bad things. We want to avoid and control those. So how can we pre-position the system, ready the system so that if we do have a Cat 5 hurricane and it destroys transmission towers, we're able to recover quickly. Next slide. Here's our metric. It's the severity risk index. We calculate this one every single day. This is a kind of time series of that metric from last year, 2019. Memorable, normal year. And but what we start seeing, kind of again with the changing resource mix, are some really interesting things. And so again, we calculate this every single day based on the amount of generation, transmission, and load that's out. And what we find is our most extreme, right, our most risky days when the most equipment is forced offline is during winter and extreme events. The third extreme event, which happens just in the beginning of October there, those are wildfire outages, transmission outages due to the wildfire. And this is a ticker for the entire North America, right? So it was large enough to really drive that metric that day. But this really helps us compare year to year and seeing how the system is bending, not quite breaking. We haven't seen even significant outages within, polar vortex type conditions, but we see the system bending, and usually you want to be able to modify behavior before it snaps. This is kind of one way we do that. Next slide. I think my final slide here is just about, again, transitioning to that future and that evolving system. There's planning tools that are required now that we have resources that are sometimes non-dispatchable. They have stochastic behavior, so you need to be able to plan better. Reserve margins, for example, are probably not the best planning measure when we're dealing with a lot of solar and wind and hydro and kind of energy constrained resources. So getting better planning tools, making adjustments within the electricity markets around incentives, reliability programs or fuel programs, looking at different regulatory models, and being we think about resilience, think about all sectors really. So electric sector can only, with the increasing natural gas on the system, electric sector can only be as successful as the natural gas sector. So making sure we have a regulatory model that incentivizes and spurs that. And then of course, national state and energy policies. Really need to look at whether we need more legislation to get larger electricity superhighways developed based on all the engineering studies I've seen, and really to get those high levels of renewables, those deep carbon reductions, you need to build more transmission. So what does that look like from a policy perspective? So I'll pause there and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, John. Very interesting and kind of scary. A question I have for you is actually a two-parter. NERC obviously has reliability in your name, doesn't have resiliency. So NERC is obviously the reliability regulator, but is it also the resilience regulator, or you're heading in that direction? And also, is it more difficult now to maintain resilience than in the past, I assume because of climate change? So tell me about NERC and resilience and what you're doing on that, and is it more difficult now than it has been?
Yeah, I think it was easier to be the reliability regulator only, and we've always had resilience built into our scope. But I think it's becoming more of a challenge because of the future and the types of resources we're bringing on the system, and also the resources we're bringing off the system. So yes, we are a resilience regulator, but probably not enough to do it on our own. It really requires some partnerships with the states and the federal regulator to identify kind of the best way to solve issues. First of all, nationally, I think is probably difficult because a lot of the resilience issues are regional, right? We don't want to buttress our transmission structures for Cat 5 hurricanes in Minnesota, but we do want to do that in Florida. We don't necessarily need redundant pipeline in Texas where there's a ton of gas wellheads and supply, but we might need to look at that for California and New England. So moving forward, I think it's becoming more difficult because there used to be some margin in the types of resources we had, coal units, for example, dirty machines, but you look in the backyard and I've got 1 month, 2 months, 3 months of resilience, right? No matter if there's something, I got some coal piles. But if you have more of these non-dispatchable resources or perhaps gas that has just-in-time delivery, well, I might be more susceptible to disruption. And so how does that influence the type of policies and our resource mix and how fast we get to the lower, deeper carbon reduction goals that we might have?
Yeah, scary stuff. That could be, for Victor, that could be another future webinar on that topic alone. Thank you, John. We're moving on now to David Victor, who, by the way, in addition to, he's very active, being the director of the Laboratory on Law and International Regulations at UC San Diego, just came out with a book. He doesn't know I'm going to say this, called Global Warming Gridlock, Creating More Effective Strategies for Protecting the Planet, and you can get it on Amazon. He is speaking, I teach up at Columbia, I'm lucky to do that, but he's speaking actually at Columbia, I think it's next week, with his co-author on that. David, why don't you fill us in on your technology changes that are going on to affect resilience?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I don't have any slides. I thought I would just talk. But the book that's coming out is Making Climate Policy Work. We have a session next week at the Energy Policy Center at Columbia. But if people want to buy the Global Warming Gridlock book as well, I'm thrilled for that. But
you write all the time, David.
Well, it's publisher perish in the academic world, as you know. So I want to talk about technology and the implications of technology in this area for how we manage the grid and who pays for it. And power users have been paying attention to these problems, to the squirrels, to the tornadoes, to the hurricanes. They're worried about long duration outages. I think I learned from Gene Fox that an outage where you lose the freezer is a big deal. An outage where you don't lose the freezer is less of a big deal for some users. But people have been paying attention to this problem. A number of users have specialized equipment, electron microscopes and so on, that need very high power quality. So they've been paying attention to that problem as well. But for a long time, most users couldn't do very much about it, except at extremely high cost. You could put in power conditioning equipment. You could buy generators. In some cases, like in hospitals, you're required to have generators. One of the things we did in the 2017 National Academy study is look at the actual reliability of some of these devices. It turns out a lot of the on-site generators actually wouldn't start reliably when needed. And so these solutions were expensive, they were clunky, the generators required regular testing, which itself produced a lot of pollution concerns. And then at the end of the day, they didn't actually fix the problems. We are on the cusp, we're in the middle of just a profound technological change that could be altering, not all of this, but a lot of it. And it's around decentralization of the grid. And the ratio of kind of hype to reality is at Silicon Valley levels right now. But there's a lot that's happening that's real around control systems, around local generators, around local storage, around devices, around smarter markets or local markets that have made it possible for a growing number of users to have greater control over their local grid environment and to prepare for extreme events in this kind of process of resilience that Granger Morgan laid out in the beginning. And it's opened up all kinds of interesting modeling opportunities. My group, partly in alliance with EPRI, has been doing work to show how we can model these decentralized grid systems or microgrids, and how we can build the better metrics for reliability and resilience into these modeling systems and so on. So this is a really, really interesting set of developments. This used to be the province of the military. Only 5 years ago or so, when you looked by volume at who had most of the microgrids in North America, they were military grids, where you have users that are willing to spend an infinite amount of money effectively for electric reliability that they control directly. think of the precious bodily fluids concerns. And they were actually backed by diesel. They were polluting. They were expensive. But they got the job done for that client. And now what we're seeing is these military applications continue to be a big part of the market, but we're seeing more commercial customers. We're seeing a lot of universities. My university, for example, runs a 47 megawatt peak microgrid with a natural gas backbone. I'll talk more about that in just a second. A lot of universities, especially universities with hospital complexes where you can do combined heat and power in a very cost-effective and also energy-efficient way. They're putting in these kinds of systems, and they have often the benefit of saving money, but they also have the benefit of much higher reliability of service, or in effect resilience of the overall system. So I think this is pretty interesting. I don't know how far this is going to go. I think actually nobody really knows how far it's going to go. There are visions of extreme decentralization, which, taken to the limit, kind of erode the need for a grid altogether. I think that's mostly fantasy, but maybe it will happen. And then there are visions where this kind of bumps along and continues to be a largely marginal activity, and the bulk of electric power services provided by the grid. But I just want to close by drawing out three implications of this shift, which is being driven by customers who are concerned about the overall resilience of the system and the quality of the system. And if C. Berry could mute his or hers microphone, that would be great, because we're getting a lot of crosstalk. Thank you very much. So one implication, natural gas. One of the things we learned in our modeling of microgrid systems is the optimal configuration of a microgrid is enormously dependent on the total size of the load. So smaller microgrids tend to, in effect, they have a little rooftop solar here and there that tends to actually be constrained by the amount of space available, maybe a little bit of embedded storage, but then in effect, what they're doing is they're managing consumption of electricity off the grid, maybe shifting it around a little bit during the day, depending on the tariff structure and so on. That's for small microgrid systems. Once you're above the kind of 5 to 10 megawatt scale, and that number is dropping, then the optimal configurations almost always involve natural gas in one way or another as the backbone. That's what we have in our microgrid system, is 47 megawatt peak load, 3 gas turbines. They do all the work. When you come visit our microgrid, we'll show you the solar panels and the batteries and the fuel cells and so on. We won't show you the gas turbines, but the gas turbines actually do all the work, or almost all the work. So I'll probably get some hate mail for saying that, but it's true. So I think that's really important for us when we think about the future of the energy system, because it's going to be the gas-electric interface that we're learning increasingly. I see JEANNE is on the call, has done a lot of work in this area. It's the gas-electric interface that's going to determine a lot of the ultimate resilience. Second implication of three from this decentralization of the grid is about emissions. One of the really striking findings from our modeling work is that when you decentralize the grid and you take on board the idea that natural gas is so central to these larger microgrids, what you see is the decentralization helps with shallow decarbonization. Gas is used. Gas is also used in CHP operations, combined heat and power operations. And so you get an overall boost in efficiency, and that helps lower emissions a little bit. But then it makes it actually much harder to decarbonize further, unless you have some strategy for dealing with natural gas, decarbonizing gas, whether it's biogas. I'm kind of a skeptic on biogas, or it's hydrogen blending or something like that. So that's really the frontier topic. And depending on whether you think there's a capacity to decarbonize a natural gas supply or not, you end up with very, very different answers as to whether this decentralization is going to be good news for deep decarbonization or bad news, kind of a cul-de-sac, if you like. And the last thing I want to end on is the value of the grid. Essentially all, except in the most remote communities that are totally removed from the grid, or people who just want to be removed from the grid, so they're willing to spend an infinite amount of money to do that, all these systems in one way or another rely on the grid. They rely on the grid for voltage and frequency support. They rely on the grid, in effect, as backup supplies or blended power supplies. We right now in our microgrid have our turbines down for regular maintenance, and we happen to have wildfire concerns here in California over the last few days. And so we're actually concerned that the uses on campus that have high value for reliable power like electron microscopes, that those need to be particularly sensitive to those kinds of concerns, because our microgrid is less reliable since our gas turbines are down. And I think we have to have mechanisms to really price accurately the value of the grid for these customers, these users that are not using much volumetrically, but are relying enormously on grid services. This is an age-old question, but it's now becoming much more acute for regulators. And one of the reasons I'm so thrilled that we have Sue TIERNEY with us today to talk about some of the regulatory dimensions. So let me stop there, Jeanne.
Great, David. Thank you. I think you covered everything I really wanted to hear. I think we'll get questions from the group too. So let's move on to Sue. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat room. We'll get to some of them pretty quickly, and Victor Glass will be the ones pulling them up. So Susan TIERNEY, obviously, is the senior advisor of the analysis group, but she is probably world renowned, but certainly nationally renowned for what she does. And she really comes from a regulatory perspective, but also the technical high-level perspective as well. Sue, take it away.
Thank you, Jeanne. And it is great to be here. Vic, could you put up my slides, please? I would appreciate it. I noticed in the list of participants, there's a whole lot of people who could be giving these talks. So I appreciate very much that you're listening in, but many of you are really experts on these issues as well. There's also a lot of friends, so hello. While Victor is putting this up, I would say, and that's, we'll get there in a sec. Victor, I normally like to say please when I give an order, but I'm just going to say next just to save time, okay? So I appreciate it. Okay, next, please. So you've heard about the resilience challenges, and I won't spend time on them except to say that I think this is a good segue from David's really interesting comments about microgrids and the trade-offs and uncertainties associated with their ability to help on resilience or help on decarbonization, which, you know, relates to extreme weather events and so forth. You know, there's a lot of growing regulatory interest in this. I would count maybe Hawaii and California as the most recent, you know, ground zero. New Jersey was there a while ago, as was Maryland, but these extreme events are very important, and the technological changes do provide some options going forward. Next. So there was a white paper written by Miles Keogh and Christina Cody in 2013 talking about the resilience issues with the audience intended to be regulators. And this is their very technical definition of what resilience means. You've heard the definitions that Granger explained, and these go to very similar points. But in typical Miles Keogh style, he used some other language. So next. So focus on it's the gear, the people, and the way the people operate the gear immediately before, during, or after a bad day that keeps everything going and minimizes the scale of interruptions. So that's what we're talking about here, getting things back to normal. And what do you want to do to pre-plan and put in place investments to minimize that or reduce the chance that you're going to have a bad day event occur? Next. So the regulator's role in resilience are a couple of things, I think. Next. First, setting expectations. And this obviously is having regulators wrestle with what resilience is going to mean in their localities, in the local service territories, either in their states or in their utility, if they're actually a board of a publicly owned utility. Are you thinking about resilience in terms of the system, or are you thinking about it in terms of types of vulnerable customers, of which there are many, of course, who really will depend and depend increasingly on an electric grid for various energy services? So setting expectations, establishing goals for what you expect from the utility in terms of and the marketplace in terms of providing resilient services, but also to understand and really wrestle with what are the sources of the risks And because there are various types of risks, cybersecurity is going to be a very different type of risk, and the mitigation actions are quite different than extreme weather events. So understanding what those are, understanding the benefits and costs of different actions to address them, setting standards for evaluating things, those are part of the job of the regulator in resilience. Next. And of course, setting the carrots and sticks. The carrots, of course, are providing the resources, financial and bandwidth and otherwise carrots to get the job done. But it's also sticks, and sticks can be punitive. They can be, they can provide direction in terms of the regulated entity avoiding those sticks. Next. And they address the accountability issue here. And so this is where measurement, performance tracking, holding service providers accountable for what they're doing is really an important job for regulators here. And it does relate to sticks. And the reason I put it that way is that utilities can, and regulated energy companies can manage certain types of risks. Other risks may be outside of their bailiwick. So to the extent that sticks, that utilities are being held accountable and penalized with sticks for risks that they really can't control, that seems like it's an area that regulators should wrestle with quite directly to align risk, accountability, and responsibility. Next. So back to that paper I mentioned a minute ago from NARUC that Miles and Christina wrote in 2013. What they did was try to think about a framework in which average day in and day out service quality differs from resilience. And next. So the first thing they did was think about these different time frames for what it means to be a resilient system before or without the event, during the event, after the event. And they would say that the normal conditions are what regulators should set for reliability standards, making sure that everybody has access to some minimum standard of quality. During the event is where, of course, resilience kicks in, and regulators should think about how hard it is to knock the system down, either a part of it or the whole thing down, and how quickly it can go back up. Next. Local regulators are used to using some certain metrics to identify service quality and resilience. Some of the service quality metrics, SAFE, MAFE, and even CAFE, I guess, those are ones where, CAFE, those are ones where they're really tracking what are customers and the system's normal operating conditions and how frequent are outages and how long are outages occurring. And those metrics do not really capture the resilience issue very well, because what they're doing is they tend to exclude long duration events. So if you want to look at resilience, you really have to include major events in the metrics that you're using. And so some of those standard service quality metrics are helpful there for measuring performance over time, but there may need to be other types of metrics, which I'll talk about in a minute, for understanding and discovering really whether there are actions that are beneficial, net beneficial, that should be taken in order to improve resilience. Next. And of course, there are many different types of things that the utilities do, for example, in terms of maintaining service quality around the clock, managing vegetation and so forth. But then there are other things that are a set of actions that are more aggressive, undergrounding, to really avoid having power lines go out in a winter storm. And then there are other things like pre-positioning and pre-arranging for mutual assistance aids and programs that really make it possible for the industry-wide to save costs by having the ability to lean on each other when needed. Now, we have seen times when there are very widespread outages where mutual assistance, everybody's having the same problem at the same time. So mutual assistance is under stress under certain types of extreme weather events that we're seeing these days. Now, I've added 2 rows to this table. Next. And these are really things that are, next again, please, things that regulators ought to be thinking about when they are thinking about resilience going forward. And that is to really understand what types of events could lead to different impacts, both in terms of scale, how wide an area would be affected and how long an outage will occur. And the statistics indicate that people find outages more painful and more precious and more dear, electricity more precious as the length of the outage occurs. Again, that's the Gene Fox rule that we all learned. But then there's also, next please, some other things that regulators might want to think about here, which is, do you want to really differentiate the resilience requirements and expectations across customer classes? For example, large industrial customers and even commercial customers are willing to pay more to avoid an outage than a typical residential customer. And they actually have the ability to pay, obviously, more to have the system hardened or put in place various provisions so that there are less outages. So one of the questions is, do you think about those different customer classes and different service quality requirements and expect that some of those customers should actually internalize some of those protections themselves, the way that David was just describing with microgrids and other things that are customer driven? Or do you have all of the population paying for having everybody have a more resilient system? Or do you want to make sure that there are some parts of the physical topology of your system where there are either water system, water quality, wastewater treatment, communication systems, hospitals, and other things, where you really want to make that a more resilient system in a targeted way? Next. So when one is thinking about the future in a climate resilient context, there are a wide variety of things that people can have done in the past that are still relevant. Hardening up your poles and wires, making sure that there's redundant facilities, improving the analytics for situational awareness, and emergency drills. But recent experience, and I would point to the PG&E's experience as the best example of this lately, is that they want to pre-position some of those distributed energy resources and microgrids so that they can put them in places where they are accessible in wildfire-prone neighborhoods of the service territory. And then, of course, the more controversial actions that people are taking to improve resilience, even though they're degrading reliability in some sense, is to anticipate outages and then actually shut off parts of the system where you may be trying to reduce the vulnerability of the system to a wildfire or a transmission-related outage or some other kind of thing. And so there are new and evolving policies that have to be tailor-made for the particular conditions that apply in certain geographic areas. Next, please. I'm almost done here. There have been some recent studies that NARUC has sponsored, one that I call your attention to here, where they studied the extent to which regulators are looking at and utilizing quantitative methods to value resiliency impacts of distributed energy resources. And the answer in this study was no, regulators are not doing that yet. But nonetheless, there are some instances where regulators in other dockets and other proceedings are thinking about distributed energy resources and are looking at their net value to consumers and the system. So next, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those methodologies that people are using. Next, please. And by the way, this table is from that same study that is cited on the prior page. So what the authors here, Converge Strategies, did was take a look at different types of different criteria for different methods of evaluating distributed energy resources. And these methods were what they wanted to do, the authors wanted to do was examine how good is a particular method at capturing value or impact given the length of an outage. That's duration. Also, they checked scalability, which in their terms was applying to large or small areas, geographic areas of a utility system. Ease of use is how easy is that methodology to run and apply to a situation. And then outputs, that's their term for are the results actually useful to decision makers and regulators when they're trying to make, say, cost recovery decisions for a microgrid and so forth. Next. So they looked across a number of cases. I'm not going to talk to you about these cases, except to say that they were all microgrid instances, and that these different approaches and methods for understanding their value, the value of the microgrid for capturing improved resiliency. What they used was this table. Green light is it's good, red light is it's not so good, and yellow is the jury is still out. And these methods included the following: contingent valuation. That's what's used in the data set for the ICE calculator, where there are lots of studies in which their surveys have been conducted to ask different types of customers what it means for them to avoid and how much are they willing to pay to avoid a long duration outage. So that's one, and that has the ease of use. It is not very helpful for looking at long duration outages because those data sets don't tend to capture those. As Granger said, we just don't have a lot of survey data that has a high N for these different studies of outages. A different approach is what's called damage cost, and this is doing actual after the fact calculations of different outages of different kinds, and then using that to apply to how much are you willing to pay to avoid those damages. And again, the jury is still out on the usefulness of this for a resilience value of different actions. Many of you may know that the third one, which is IMPLAN. This is a macroeconomic model that looks at the direct and indirect and induced responses in the economy to a change. And here the change would be loss of electricity. And this one, the jury is entirely out about its ability to capture for regulatory value the impacts of different DERs for resilience. And then finally, defensive behavior is the final methodology that they looked at. And this was how much are you willing to spend? Carlos, would you turn off your, sorry. Carlos Correa, please turn off your mic. Okay. And this final one is just assessments that compare the cost to invest in say a genset or a microgrid compared to a DER, and what is the difference in terms of outcome, in terms of reliability and the ability to maintain a resilient system. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done here. It's not going to be in my generation that it happens. I hope that many of you who are on the phone and working with regulators can help improve these metrics and methods to make them more useful for regulators making decisions about utility investments. Finally, next. I just want to give a shout out to the fact that NARUC has just set up a new presidential task force on emergency preparedness, recovery, and resiliency. And the main thing I just wanted to highlight here is that I see that there is really heightened attention from regulators in looking at these questions. Of course, many of them are COVID driven, but many of them are associated with these extreme weather events. And so I really am hopeful that this task force can identify a number of needs in the regulatory community to make this a more useful set of metrics and methods. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was really good. And as a lifelong regulator, my whole career was regulating. There are, as we know, very limited sources for state regulators in a lot of areas now. COVID doesn't help with the states and their budgets. So what are the higher priority issues for regulators, federal and state, but primarily state, I think. But then also, are there any best practices, regulatory tools that might be used that the states or NARUC together can focus on? So what are the highest priority issues, and then any best practices out there?
I would say a high priority would be situational awareness and making investments that really enable the operators of the grid to identify where things are happening during an event, who's got an outage, use those capabilities to actually then follow procedures to address critical services, vulnerable populations, and so forth. I think one tool for that is obviously advanced metering that gives a lot of visibility to the grid operators. And I know that AMI is quite controversial in some states about whether or not the value proposition is there. There are many states in the country, and I'm thinking of the South, for example, where very big outages associated with hurricanes were caused such widespread and long-lived outages for customers that they were able to, the utilities, Southern, for example, was able to make the value proposition for investing in universal AMI in order to shorten those outages and shorten the pain associated with hurricanes and the expectation that there would be repeated rounds of hurricanes in the future. Other states might look to those kinds of proceedings and the methods that were used to value the AMI proposition. Jean, what was your second one? That was just a thought about priority.
Best practices.
Well, I'll just say ditto for that one, and like to hear from others.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll have Victor Glass go to questions in the chat room. I do have obviously more questions as well. As the New Jersey customer who lost electricity for 6 days during Sandy, I deeply appreciated my next door neighbor's long extension cord. So I could keep my refrigerator running, I could have one light on, and I could charge our phones and laptops. There are a lot of individual residential customers and small businesses like me who want that access to just a small amount of power during an emergency, who don't want to have to pay for the laboratories and universities and that kind of entities that obviously need 24/7 or close to that backup. So yeah. Granger, you have a student working on that, and I know other people also have ideas about that, because you got to balance cost, as was mentioned, by the reliability and resiliency. What are you, Granger, and then everybody else? What do you think about that for a person like me that just wants to keep my refrigerator going and charge my phone and my laptop? Granger, you're on mute.
While he's coming in.
Yeah. Victor, I have a couple of slides. I'll be very quick with them. So if you would just put them up.
I really commend this study to everybody. It's very interesting.
This is Granger.
Yeah, Granger study. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, while it's coming up, Susan, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, they're just really doing a lot of analysis to see the question that you posed, Jean. How viable is it from an economic point of view? How attractive is it from a customer preference point of view? And how technically one could accomplish just what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, I just did a panel this morning with our ratepayer advocate for AARP. There were over 5,000 AARP members in New Jersey listening to this, and it was about utilities and the cost to them. We have something like 500,000 people in the state, customers in the state, who are having a tough time paying their bills now. So this is really working class people, seniors, people in fixed incomes, people who can't pay their bills now. They just want the basic, be able to exist in their own home when there's an outage, and it will continue. So,
Victor, are we going to be able to get these few slides? You're muted.
Granger, why don't you maybe start talking about it?
Yeah, sure. Well, so, even a very little bit of power can be really valuable during one of these long outages. For example, we routinely pay, a little under $2 for a D-cell alkaline battery that can produce 0.017 kilowatt hours that yields the equivalent of a price of basically something just of the order of $100 a kilowatt hour. So when you don't have any electricity, a little bit can be very valuable. Now, if we could just get that on, yeah. So next, okay. For some reason, I've now got stuff in front of my screen of.
I can see it.
Yeah, okay, fine, forget it. Next slide. So we've been studying people's willingness to pay for full or partial power during long outages large outages of long duration. Next, and next, and it turns out that for something like a 10-day outage, when the weather is bad, people are willing to pay a couple of dollars or more per kilowatt hour, and they're also willing to pay something for sustaining the private demands of their community. So there are several papers out that describe that stuff. Next. David talked quite a bit about microgrids and essentially smart grid kinds of stuff. Next. But I want to remind you that there are regulatory obstacles here. For example, under federal law, if I've got an office building like the one shown there on the top of that lower diagram, I can build a small generator, be interconnected to the grid, and serve the various floors of my building. But the minute I take that thing apart and I plop those different things down across the landscape under exclusive service territory rules in most of the U.S., that's not legal. Next. So we've been working on coming up with a variety of strategies that would allow one during such outages to build, for example, to reconfigure distribution systems. Next, cycling, for example, among critical loads, since on a distribution system, if you had some distributed resources, you probably couldn't serve all the loads, but you could figure out ways to cycle and support some of them. Next. And my current doctoral student, Angela Bowman, has been working first in New England and now more recently on Caribbean islands, asking if generation of different sorts out across the distribution feeder, what's this going to cost? Next. And she's been able to price this stuff out and found that the annual cost to provide these sorts of services to people is probably quite affordable. And the last slide shows some other strategies that we probably ought to be thinking about. Last slide, that we ought to be thinking about, such as worrying about, David talked about the fact that diesels often haven't started in the past. So we need to worry more about that. We need to worry about fuel supply contracts. We need to think about other stuff that we could press into service during large outages. For example, having on hand boxes of power electronics so that you can take energy out of a diesel locomotive and supply local loads. Technologies and strategies that would make it possible to use some local power when power is out, because in many parts of the country, photovoltaic systems go offline as soon as the bulk power goes off. And though it would probably violate warranties under current rules, as we get more and more hybrid and fuel cell vehicles, that's another source that in principle might be used to reduce our vulnerability to large outages of long duration. And with that, I'm going to quit. You can take the slide down.
Yes. Okay. Anybody want to add anything to that? We have 8 or 9 more minutes for questions, although we can stay over if we need to.
Yeah, this is
Go
Jay
ahead.
Apt. I could just add something to that, which is my student, Dan Schnitzer, some years ago, did some work looking at what people paid for charging their cell phones in Africa and the Caribbean and so forth. And for that little bit of power, it's up to $25 a kilowatt hour. For a flip phone and $5 a kilowatt hour for a smartphone. So Granger's number for the battery may even be a little bit low. You are willing to pay a lot for the first little bit of power.
And JAP is at Carnegie Mellon as well. And he's a former astronaut, but we won't get into that. Thanks, Jay.
Let me add that I think that this research area is very informative about what little amount of electricity we need today for our phones and so forth. In a world that many people talk about, in which your heating system is going to be electric and your vehicle is going to be electric, you're going to need a whole lot of power in order to, just to maintain your normal existence. And so I encourage researchers to think about that question of what are some of the implications for resilience going forward in people's needs in an all electric world. It's going to be very different.
But even if I'm not all electric, Jean, I mean, suppose, for example, we convert heating systems to hydrogen. I'm still going to need some electricity to run blowers or pumps for my heating.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, and
I guess
with energy storage and where we stand with storage, I mean, it's progressing, but we have a long way to go in that. David, were you adding something, or John?
Yeah, I just want to say, the world where things are heavily electrified is a world that's probably driven by concerns about carbon. And to me, one of the things that's interesting is to see how so many of the high value, lower cost solutions are fossil fuel solutions, and for all the understandable reasons. And I think you're going to see a lot of regulatory concern about that. It may be misplaced, but it's going to be a lot of regulatory concern about it. We've seen this here. So there was a big push to see, well, could we do more on the microgrids front? And the answer is yes. And we could do it almost immediately if we had diesel-backed microgrids. And then everyone had a heart attack about that idea. And so that's kind of reset the dialogue. And I think when you look at the economics, they make a huge amount of sense. But when you look at the direction of travel politically in terms of emissions and so on, they don't make as much sense. And those worlds are going to collide.
And David, one of the issues, as you pointed out, is microgrids now with combined heat and power, et cetera, solar, probably some small wind, are very good. And actually, San Diego, UC San Diego, Princeton, Rutgers has those things, but they are gas-driven, natural gas-driven. That's an issue. Where do you think hydrogen fits in?
Well, so that's one of the solutions potentially is, so Irvine is doing more on this than we are, and we're always in a little bit of an arms race with Irvine, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with the Irvine microgrid where they're blending on an experimental basis some hydrogen in, and they've been doing a lot of work on levels of blending with the turbines and so on. So that's interesting. I think at this point, we don't know. If you were running a microgrid and you're under pressure to get emissions down, what you do, and you're using gas, what you do right now is you go buy credits for biogas. I myself am skeptical that biogas is going to scale, or at least scale without big ecological consequences, but there's a big debate underway about that, and the American Gas Association has a different view, and so on and so on and so on. But depending on your views about the future of biogas, then hydrogen may or may not become much more important. I think hydrogen play is going to be vitally important.
Yeah, and so many of the participants on this call may be unaware that while up until fairly recently, hydrogen has not gotten a lot of attention here in North America, it is front and center in the EU, and you might simply go online and look for the EU hydrogen plan, which is very aggressive.
I guess one question is, why isn't that happening here? But I think that's for another.
It is beginning to happen. I mean, a couple of years ago, or a year ago, the EPRI Summer Seminar, for example, talked a lot about it. But it's been slower to come here than it has been in Europe because, in general, we've been slower on decarbonizing than a lot of Europe has been.
And my personal thought on that is, because I don't work for anybody, is that most of our electric utilities don't want that type of competition. Could I note, there's a note on chat from Michael Hogan, our colleague from Harvard, who's originally from New Jersey, I might add, talking about smaller co-ops in the Midwest. So these are not public utilities, these are private public co-ops, but have heavy resilience on, they provide free storage electric water heaters for customers, which is something that obviously is energy storage for those that know that. And that's an issue that really isn't being used much in this country, at least where we have utilities. Any thoughts on that before we do conclusions?
Yeah, I think that's more an issue for reliability than resilience. So a water heater, if I can cycle water heaters, for example, that's great. But if I'm out for 3 days and I've got electric water heaters, I'm not going to be able to do much with them after the first day or so.
All right. Okay. So that's a reliability issue. And then I guess we should conclude soon. I just want to mention that Robert, how do you say Robert's last name? Entrikin?
Yes.
Okay. He says, if we could have a follow-up discussion, what subject would be next? I would suggest that everybody who's on this, and some very impressive names that are in the participant list, you could send to Victor Glass, and you have his address because that's where you registered, items and topics that you think that he might be able to follow up on with his Center for Regulation Industries, and we can move on some of those in the future. I want to ask the panelists, any final thoughts from you for everybody on this? Start with Granger. No Granger? Any final thoughts? I'm going to Granger, then John, then David, then Sue.
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, John, Mr. Reliance and Reliability. MOURA?
Yeah, just to close it out. Yeah, I appreciate being involved. When you're thinking about the bulk power system, I know we're getting a little bit more on the distribution side and kind of making sure customers, have reliable and resilient service. While at the same time, the bulk system's changing, and getting power from where it is generated to where it is consumed is very important. I think that's one of the reasons, at least in Germany, why they've been advanced with hydrogen is because the trouble in building more overhead transmission across Germany to bring the wind from the north down to the load areas. And so they have a lot of excess wind generation up there. And so a good way to put it to use could be development of hydrogen. But when we talk to them, one of the things that they hoped that could be a lesson to us was planning our system holistically and looking for the opportunity to build, they call it extensions, we call it transmission expansion, to really get us an idea of transmission expansion. Because by doing that and opening up and having more access to more resources across the country gives us a lot more flexibility and options. Because kind of thinking about all hazards planning, we want diversity of our resources. And so whether it's microgrids powered by a diverse set of fuels, whether it's some fossil fuels, whether it's some nuclear units, some DER, which can really help from a distributed standpoint, and all of the above solution will really help us the best get through kind of all hazards. So appreciate being involved here, and any way else I can help. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Guess just very briefly, I have to go at the bottom of the hour. I'm worried about inequality. Almost everything that's interesting here in terms of the future of the grid and the future of the energy system, frankly, it involves basically trading operating costs for capital costs. And that's going to have big implications for the folks that we've been talking about who can't pay their bills right now. As all else equal, the gains from capital accrue to more or less rich people and not poor people. And that's the world we're in, where there's already acute concerns about inequality. And then here we're going to amplify those challenges. I'm very concerned about that.
You're right. Before COVID hit us, we had the biggest wage gap in the United States between rich people and everybody else since the Great Depression. And that was before COVID, and it's made it worse. You're right, David. And last but not least, certainly, Sue.
I would affiliate with those last comments that David said and encourage regulators to think creatively about how to separate system resiliency from resiliency and of access to energy that's affordable for that population.
Thank you. And then we'll just turn to Victor Glass, our host, to sum up whatever he wants to sum up. Victor.
Well, actually, I want to congratulate you on a wonderful webinar. It's been very informative. It seems like there are a lot of open issues about resiliency. And I want to pick up a little bit on the last comment about the effects of distribution of income. JEANNE is going to be involved in another webinar that's coming up on rate restructuring, where people are going to talk about different ways to set rates. And one of the pressing issues there is whether how is it going to affect low-income customers if you go to time of use, net metering, and other types of pricing schemes. So anyway, I think everybody who was here and listened, congratulate you. A wonderful, wonderful webinar, and thanks again. We'll be in touch. And please, anybody who has suggestions for new webinars, please send them to me, and we'll evaluate them and try to address the needs of the people here. Okay?
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great holiday season. Stranger
Bye-bye
than
all.
it may be.
Take care.
Bye-bye.